Good morning, everyone. We will start the semester by revisiting the concepts that were introduced in the spring and continue discussing about environmental problems around the world. Specifically, last semester, we discussed the role of international agreements and organizations in solving global problems. And we also talked about the challenges individual governments face when cooperating with each other. To emphasize this, I raise the example of climate change and how certain governments are not willing to cooperate with each other to address the problem, which is an issue not just affecting one country, but affecting humanity as a whole. This time, rather than focusing on the role of international governance, in today's lecture, we will focus on human behavior and how this leads to the destruction of our natural environment. To emphasize this topic, first, I will introduce a theory that explains how human behavior can affect the environment. Then I will give a couple of examples illustrating this theory, and then I will end this lecture by discussing about the moral implications. First, I'll explain how human behavior affects the environment, specifically using one theory to explain this behavior. So, in 1960, Garrett Hardin, an ecologist, wrote an article for the Journal of Science, providing one explanation to why humans destroy the environment, even if they know their actions are detrimental to his or her own well-being and the well-being of others. Now, imagine the following situation. There are several farmers who have access to a nearby pasture, meaning any of them is freely allowed to use the space. Each farmer have a set of cows, which therefore the pasture is necessary for the farmers to maintain their herd of cows. As a rational being, each farmer seeks to maximize his gain. In other words, in economic terms, to get as much profit as possible. In such a case, the farmer would increase the number of cows. Why is this? Well, it's because more cows mean more milk or more meat, which leads to more profits. This is also caused by the farmer being self-interested. If the farmer doesn't add more cows, he or she will lose out to other farmers who all have the same thinking, which is to add more cows and raise more profits. Now, imagine all of these farmers adding all of these cows in the pasture in an area that is fixed, meaning the size of the pasture does not change. What are the effects of this? Well, the pasture becomes overgrazed, meaning the pasture becomes exhausted because the grass cannot grow faster than the amount the cows consume. According to Hardin, this phenomenon occurs in a commons, or in other words, a natural resource shared by many individuals. So, based on the situation I described earlier, the pasture or the grass is the shared resource, or the commons. In this context, shared means that each individual does not have a claim to any part of the resource, but rather to the use of a portion of it for his or her own benefit. Typically, self-interest results in the overuse of a shared resource, and everyone ultimately suffers due to such selfish behavior. Everyone suffers because, in the end, the resource is exhausted. In the earlier example, the pasture is the one getting exhausted, and no one in the end will be able to get any benefit from it. The tragedy here is that without some form of regulation, for example, government laws, this will lead to individuals having the tendency to exploit the commons to his or her own advantage, typically without limit. In this situation, the commons is depleted and eventually ruined. This situation is known as a tragedy of the commons. This tragedy came as a result of the uncontrolled self-interest of some individuals. The underlying reasoning is that if everyone expects the commons to be eventually exhausted, whoever gets the greatest use of it stands to benefit the most. In other words, each individual will try to get more from the resource before anyone else. Under some circumstances, while the benefits may go to one individual, the costs are spreading among all others sharing the commons. Now, many of you may think this example of the grass and cows is too simplistic or not very realistic. However, there are many examples in the real world that supports this theory of the tragedy of the commons. Now, let's talk about some of these examples. First, let's recall the example of climate change we discussed last semester. we talked about how international agreements are useful in getting countries together to support for causes that are beneficial to everyone. In this case, monitoring and restricting CO2 emissions are beneficial to all countries because we get to mitigate, or in other words, lower the negative effects of climate change. However, some countries, such as the United States, would not support such agreements, such as the Paris Accord, on the basis that these restrictions to emissions hurt the US economy. Now, imagine a world without any regulations on CO2 emissions. What are the consequences of this? Hardin would say that each country would do whatever it takes to increase production. Without it, a country will not be able to stay competitive against other countries. In a world that measures a country's success by increases in GDP, production becomes a priority. However, we all know that more production leads to more CO2 emissions. Believe it or not, the atmosphere, or the air around us, is in itself a commons. The atmosphere is necessary for all living things, which is an undeniable benefit to all humankind. However, the more we produce and release CO2 emissions, the more our atmosphere becomes unusable. Similar to Hardin's example of cows and green pasture, we are pumping CO2 in the atmosphere faster than the Earth's ability to absorb it into the ground. Increases in CO2 in the atmosphere consequently leads to extreme weather events, less breathable air, and less food, among other issues. These are problems shared by everyone around the world. Another example that has a more immediate effect on our lives are fisheries, or in other words, areas where fish are caught. Even though waters near a country's border are usually regulated and protected by respective governments, a vast area of the world's oceans are unregulated, areas also known as international waters. International waters are perfect examples of commons, since countries have unrestricted access to the resources that are available in those waters. What are the effects of this? The tendency is that countries will try to extract as many resources as possible in these waters. In this case, a country will try to get as many fish as possible before anyone else. Because everyone has the same way of thinking, overfishing will occur in the oceans, which means fish are being extracted faster than its ability to regenerate, similar to Hardin's example of pasture and the tragedy of the commons. Let's look at a specific example of this problem. Just last year, the Japanese government noticed a significant decline of sari. Sari is commonly known here in Japan as sanma, which is a popular fish in Japan that we see often on our dinner plates. Sari was not very popular among other Asian countries until recently. Chinese demand for sari increased significantly, causing concerns for overfishing. According to the Japanese government, Japan generally fishes sari near its coasts that are regulated economic zones, while countries like Taiwan and China fish in the open ocean, or in other words, international waters. China's catch increased 24 times since 2012 when it began fishing for sari. In response to this, Japan wanted to propose quotas or limitations at the annual meeting of the North Pacific Fisheries Commission, because it believes that overfishing in international waters is reducing the species before it migrates to Japan's coastal waters. However, China disagrees with this, claiming that natural stocks of sari are not in decline. Because of these disagreements, negotiations failed and no limitations on catches were implemented. Why does this happen? Well, simply there are no laws that control their behavior. Fishing on the open ocean is not illegal, and no catch quotas or limitations are needed as long as the stocks of fish remain stable. But the problem here is assessing whether the stocks are stable or the amount of fish that is available is a difficult task, and often countries disagree on whether there is even a problem, hence why countries keep sending their ships and fish as much as they can. These examples raises moral implications, however. Many of you in this classroom may start thinking, okay, let's implement more regulations. We need to stop being selfish. We need to change our behavior because if we don't, our world is going to get destroyed. However, as recent history shows, it is not very easy to make those changes. As we discussed last year on international governance, a country does not want its sovereignty to be affected. In other words, countries do not want others giving them orders and telling them what to do. For example, don't countries have the right to feed its own citizens? Shouldn't we allow China to feed its 1.5 billion population? How about the New York Times article you have read for homework? Do we have the right to tell Brazilians or the Brazilian government to stop deforestation? If we force them to stop, how many livelihoods or people's lives are going to be affected? How about the jobs of farmers? How are they going to get money and feed themselves? But if they don't stop, the world is going to lose its biggest source of oxygen, which is a problem for all humankind. The possible consequences are numerous. So, where do we prioritize? Well, there are no easy answers to these questions, and certainly I don't have clear answers either. I hope you like this lecture. Please make sure you review your notes in preparation for your group presentations. Thank you for listening.